In the long, dark history of submarine warfare, there is one rule that was never meant to be broken. You do not fight a destroyer. A submarine is a phantom, a ghost in the water. It hunts the slow, lumbering cargo ships and tankers that are the lifeblood of an enemy's war machine. But the destroyer is the wolf. It is fast, it is lethal, and it was built for one purpose: to hunt the hunter. In the Second World War, for an American submarine to be caught by a Japanese destroyer was in most cases a death sentence. Between December 1941 and the spring of 1944, Japanese destroyers had successfully sunk 14 American submarines in combat. In that same period, the number of Japanese destroyers sunk by an American sub while both were actively engaged in a fight was 0. The math was simple. A destroyer could race along at 35 knots. A submerged submarine running on batteries struggled to reach 9. The destroyer had sonar and was loaded with depth charges. The submarine had to hide blind and silent. The doctrine was clear. If a destroyer finds you, you dive deep, you rig for silent running, and you pray. But in 1944, one man decided to rewrite the rules. His name was Commander Samuel Dealey, and he didn't just fight the wolf, he hunted it. What he and his 79 men did in just 4 days was so unbelievable, it not only shocked the Imperial Japanese Navy to its core, it changed the entire course of the war in the Pacific. This is the story of the USS Harder, the destroyer killer. To understand what Samuel Dealey did, you first have to understand the man himself. He was 37 years old, a 1930 graduate of the Naval Academy. He was quiet, unassuming, and wore spectacles. But beneath that calm exterior was a core of pure steel, forged under the command of the legendary William "Mush" Morton, the skipper of the USS Wahoo. Dealey had been Morton's executive officer, and he learned from the best. He learned that aggression, surprise, and absolute audacity were weapons just as powerful as any torpedo. By 1944, Dealey had his own command, the Gato-class submarine USS Harder. On his 5th war patrol, he put those lessons into practice in a way that left the Navy stunned. On April 13, 1944, near the island of Guam, the Harder was hunting a convoy when its escort, the Japanese destroyer Akazuchi, spotted him. The Akazuchi turned and charged at flank speed, intent on ramming or depth-charging the submarine into oblivion. Every man in Harder's conning tower expected the order to dive. Instead, Dealey ordered, "Flank speed ahead, make ready the bow tubes." He was charging straight at the destroyer. This was a tactic so reckless it was barely even a theory. It was called the down-the-throat shot. You fire your torpedoes directly into the face of the charging enemy, and then, at the last possible second, you crash dive and pray you get deep enough to pass under his keel. If your torpedoes miss, the destroyer is in the perfect position to drop its depth charges directly on your position. If you dive too late, his bow will slice your submarine in half. At a range of just 900 yards, point-blank range in naval terms, Harder fired a spread of 4 torpedoes. 2 of them struck the Akazuchi amidships. The destroyer erupted in a massive explosion, broke in 2, and sank in less than 5 minutes. Dealey surfaced, surveyed the wreckage, and sent one of the most famous radio reports of the entire war. It was short, and it was brutally clear. Expended 4 torpedoes and 1 destroyer. This single act of defiance sent a shockwave through the Pacific submarine force, but it also put a target on Dealey's back. Admiral Toyoda, the commander-in-chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet, was not amused. By the spring of 1944, Japan was in a desperate position. Between January and May alone, they had lost 23 destroyers, not just to submarines, but to carrier aircraft and surface battles. These ships were the irreplaceable sheepdogs of the fleet, the only vessels fast enough to protect Japan's carriers and battleships from American submarines. Toyoda was gathering every ship he had for one last massive gamble. It was called Operation Ago, a plan to lure the American invasion fleet into the Philippine Sea and annihilate it in one Kai-Kesan, the decisive battle that Japanese naval doctrine had dreamed of for decades. To do this, he concentrated the entire Japanese mobile fleet at a remote forward anchorage called Tawi-Tawi in the Sulu archipelago. It was the largest concentration of Japanese naval power since the Battle of Midway. The numbers were staggering: 4 battleships, including the super battleship Yamato, 9 aircraft carriers, 15 cruisers, and 28 precious destroyers. They were a coiled spring waiting for the American invasion of the Marianas to begin. But American code breakers at Haipo in Hawaii knew they were there, and Admiral Charles Lockwood, the commander of the Pacific Submarine Force, knew exactly who to send. He sent the one man who wasn't afraid of destroyers. He sent Samuel Dealey Harder. His orders were simple: get into the Hornet's Nest, patrol the waters around Tawi-Tawi, and attack any targets of opportunity. For 9 agonizing days, Harder operated completely undetected, slipping between Japanese patrols, charting the fleet movements. Delay was a phantom, just miles from the most heavily guarded anchorage on Earth. Then his luck ran out. At 0300 on June 6, 1944, the same day Allied troops were storming the beaches in Normandy, a Japanese patrol plane flying in the dark spotted the faint feather of Harder's periscope wake. The alarm was sounded. The hunt was on. Within an hour, 3 destroyers, the Minazuki, Hayanami, and Tanakaze, were detached from the fleet with one simple order: find and kill the American submarine. At 0647, as the first light of dawn streaked the sky, Commander Delay stood in the conning tower, his eye pressed to the periscope. He watched as the 3 destroyers cut through the water, coming right for him. He was 37 years old. This was his 5th war patrol. He had already destroyed 18 enemy ships, but now 3 of the deadliest ships in the Japanese Navy were hunting him simultaneously. If you find this kind of detail, forgotten history, as fascinating as we do, we'd be honored if you'd hit that subscribe button. We believe these stories of courage and sacrifice deserve to be told, and by subscribing, you help us ensure they aren't forgotten. Back in the conning tower, Delay studied the lead destroyer, the Minazuki. She was 2,500 tons of gray steel, armed with 4 5-inch guns and closing fast, zigzagging to throw off a torpedo solution. Behind her, the other 2 destroyers were spreading out, a classic search-and-destroy pattern designed to box the submarine into a kill zone. Every man in the Harder knew the book. They were supposed to run. They were supposed to dive to 400 feet and pray the sonar operators were having a bad day. But Delay had no intention of running. He swung Harder's bow and pointed it directly at the charging Minazuki. "Make ready the bow tubes," he ordered. The range closed, 1,500 yards, 1,200 yards. The sonar pings from the Minazuki were now a frantic, high-pitched clang, clang, clang that every man in the boat could hear through the hull. The destroyer knew where they were. "Range, 1,100 yards," the fire control officer called out. The time to collision was just 96 seconds. Delay was calm. He was waiting for the Minazuki to commit. At 750 yards, less than half a mile, the destroyer was so close Delay could see the bone in her teeth, the white bow wave she was pushing. "Fire 1, fire 2, fire 3. 3 Mark 18 electric torpedoes sped silently toward the target. "Take her down 300 feet, all ahead full." The Harder pitched down at a brutal 30-degree angle, her motor screaming as she clawed for depth. This was the moment of truth. 40 seconds after firing, two massive explosions shook the Harder so violently that light fixtures shattered and cork insulation rained down from the overhead. Then a third shattering blast lifted the submarine's stern 6 feet out of the water before slamming it back down, throwing men from their feet. Delay brought the boat back to periscope depth where the Minazuki had been. There was nothing but a column of black smoke, debris, and a spreading oil slick. The destroyer had been broken in half. She was gone. But this was no time to celebrate. The other two destroyers, the Hayanami and Tenakazi, were now racing away, not toward him, but away, dropping depth charges at random in a panic. They clearly believed they had stumbled into a whole wolf pack of American submarines, not a single audacious attacker. Delay let them go. He slipped away into the deep. One hunter was dead. When Admiral Toyoda received the news at 0900, he was incensed. He ordered 6 more destroyers to join the hunt. By noon, the sky over Tawi-Tawi was thick with patrol planes, searching every 20 minutes. The entire anchorage was on high alert. Samuel Dealey, however, wasn't finished. In fact, he was just getting started. He spent the rest of June 6th evading patrols, diving deep when the planes came over, his crew silent, the air in the boat growing thick with the smell of diesel, sweat, and stale coffee. They were being hunted by the most powerful fleet in the Pacific, and their commander was reloading. Early in the morning of June 7th, at 0230, Harder surfaced to recharge her batteries. The night was pitch black, with no moon and a heavy cloud cover. It was perfect submarine weather. At 0312, the radar operator called out, "Radar contact, single ship, bearing 095, range 8,000 yards, closing fast." Delay was on the bridge in an instant. The contact was moving at 28 knots. There was no question it was another destroyer. This was the Hayanami, one of the 2 destroyers that had fled the previous day. Her captain, Commander Hideo Kuboki, had been searching for the American sub all night. He was exhausted, and at 0300 he had received orders to return to Tawi. He was heading home. In the dark, nobody on his bridge expected an American submarine to be waiting for him, let alone to attack him on the surface. Delay ordered flank speed. Harder's big diesel engines roared to life, pushing the submarine to 21 knots, a race in the dark. Delay was deliberately closing the range, trying to get inside the destroyer's radar detection ring before they could get a clear picture of him.
At 4,000 yards, the Hayanami's radar operator finally picked up a contact. It was small, moving fast. He likely assumed it was just another Japanese patrol boat returning to base. At 3,000 yards, Commander Kabuki realized his fatal mistake. That wasn't a patrol boat. It was an American submarine, and it was attacking him. He ordered flank speed and a hard turn to ram, but it was too late. Dai gave the order. Fire 1, fire 2, fire 3, fire 4. From 2,300 yards, 4 torpedoes leaped from the Harder. 2 of them struck the Hayanami's starboard side, right near the aft magazine. The resulting explosion was catastrophic. The entire stern of the destroyer was torn completely off. The ship rolled over 90 degrees, her propellers still spinning uselessly in the air, and she sank stern first. Commander Kabuki and 147 of his sailors went with her. Dai gave the order, "Crash dive!" He knew that patrol planes would be overhead within minutes. He had just sunk 2 Japanese destroyers in less than 24 hours, right on the doorstep of their main fleet anchorage. The Imperial Japanese Navy wasn't just hunting him anymore. This was personal. Admiral Toyoda was furious. He was now facing a crisis. 2 destroyers gone, sunk by the same submarine. This was not just a nuisance, it was a profound humiliation and a critical loss of his anti-submarine screen. He immediately pulled 8 more destroyers from convoy escort duty, ships that were desperately needed to protect his tankers and transports, and organized them into dedicated hunter-killer groups. Their only mission? Find and destroy the American submarine at Tawi-Tawi. Every Japanese destroyer captain in the area received the same orders. Maximum aggression, no retreat. Kill that submarine. Samuel Dealey knew the hornet's nest was well and truly stirred. A sane commander would have taken his 2 victories and left the area at high speed. But Dealey was not a sane commander. He was a hunter. On June 8th, he took Harder south toward the Sibutu Passage. This was the narrow, deep-water strait between Tawi-Tawi and Borneo. It was the main shipping lane, and Dealey knew the Japanese destroyers would be patrolling it heavily. He wanted to see just how many he could sink before they finally figured out what he was doing. At 1400 hours, the lookout spotted them. "Smoke on the horizon! 2 ships!" It was the Tanakaze, the 3rd destroyer from the original hunting party, along with an unidentified escort. They were steaming in formation at 25 knots, sweeping the passage. Dealey submerged and began his approach. For 90 long minutes, he just watched. He studied their movements. He saw they were following a predictable zigzag pattern, changing course every 8 minutes. This was sloppy. It gave him a window, maybe 30 seconds after each turn, to set up and fire. So he positioned Harder directly in their path, raised his periscope, and waited. At 16:30, right on schedule, the Tanakaze turned toward Harder's position. "Range, 3,000 yards, Dealey said, his voice calm. He let her come. 2,500 yards, 2,500. The Tanakaze was so close, her bow filled the periscope's view. At 12,200 yards, Dealey gave the order. "Fire 1, fire 2, fire 3, fire 4. He fired a wide spread with 17-second intervals between each torpedo to make sure one of them hit. The first torpedo missed, running just ahead of the bow, but the second struck the Tanakaze right near the bridge. The third torpedo hit just seconds later, detonating the forward magazine. The explosion was so massive that the crew inside Harder, deep underwater, heard it clearly. A deep, crunching hump that vibrated through their bones. The Tanakaze's entire bow section was separated from the main hull, and both pieces sank in less than 3 minutes. The escort destroyer, seeing its partner disappear in a ball of fire, went berserk. It immediately turned and charged Harder's position, dropping depth charges as it came. "Take her deep, 400 feet, Dealey commanded. The depth charges exploded overhead, shaking the submarine violently, but they were dropped in panic, not with precision. They caused no serious damage. After 40 minutes of this, the lone destroyer, likely fearing it was next, gave up the hunt and withdrew to rescue survivors. 3 destroyers, 3 days. The news hit Admiral Toyoda's flagship like a physical blow. The Devil of Tawi-Tawi, as the Japanese were now calling this lone submarine, had struck again. Toyoda was about to make a decision that would change the entire course of the Battle of the Philippine Sea. But first, Samuel Dealey had one more destroyer to sink, and this time he was going to do it in broad daylight with 2 other Japanese destroyers watching. On June 9th, at 0500, Dealey brought Harder to periscope depth, just 12 miles southwest of the Tawi-Tawi anchorage. What he saw made every man in the conning tower hold his breath. Dead ahead, steaming in a perfect line of breast formation, were 4 Japanese destroyers. They weren't transiting. They were actively hunting. Their sonar was pinging so loudly that Harder's sound operator could hear it clearly without his headphones.
This was the hunter-killer group sent specifically for him. D checked his torpedo status. He had 8 torpedoes remaining, 4 destroyers. This meant he would get maybe 1 shot before all 4 of them converged on his position and buried him under an avalanche of depth charges. He studied their formation. The lead destroyer on the end was zigzagging aggressively. The 3rd and 4th destroyers were also moving erratically. But the 2nd destroyer in the line, for some reason, she was maintaining a steady course. That was his target. At 0612, the 2nd destroyer turned directly toward Harder's position. It was a routine turn in her search pattern, but it sealed her fate. Range 4,000 yards. D waited. 3,000 yards. The sonar pings were deafening. 2,500 yards. At 1,800 yards, D spoke. "Fire 1. Fire 2. Fire 3. He didn't fire his usual spread of 4. He needed to save his torpedoes. He was betting everything on this 1 shot. All three torpedoes struck the destroyer's port side within 5 seconds of each other. The ship didn't just explode, it disintegrated. The blast was so violent that debris, chunks of the deck, guns, pieces of the superstructure flew 300 feet into the air. The ship rolled over and was gone in 90 seconds. The other three destroyers, witnessing this, reacted with absolute fury. They immediately converged on Harder's last known position. "Emergency deep, 500 feet, D roared. The Harder nosed over and plunged. Depth charges began exploding overhead almost immediately. 23 of them in the first 10 minutes. The explosions were bone-jarring. The lights in the submarine went out, and the dim red emergency lighting kicked in. The hull plates groaned and popped under the immense pressure, a sound the crewmen called the bends. A pipe burst in the forward torpedo room, spraying high-pressure seawater across the deck. But the crew was silent. They were veterans. They moved in the dark, repairing the damage, while the world outside their thin steel hull was nothing but thunder. For 2 solid hours, the three destroyers hunted them. They crisscrossed the spot, dropping charge after charge. But D was just as good at evasion as he was at attacking. He kept Harder deep and silent, anticipating their moves, until finally the destroyers gave up. They likely assumed the submarine had been destroyed by the sheer volume of their attack. At periscope depth, the sea was empty. 4 destroyers sunk in just 4 days. D wasn't thinking about his success. He was thinking about his fuel gauges. Harder had burned through 60% of her diesel reserves. She had 5 torpedoes left, but she could only stay on station for maybe 3 more days. While D was checking his fuel, the report of the 4th sinking reached Admiral Yuzaburo Ozawa, the commander of the mobile fleet, who was still at Tawi-Tawi. Ozawa did the math. 4 destroyers sunk in 4 days by 1 submarine, right outside his main fleet anchorage. If a single American submarine could penetrate his defensive screen this easily and sink his best escorts at will, the entire anchorage was a death trap. All his carriers, all his battleships were just sitting ducks. He sent an urgent, panicked message to Admiral Toyoda. The mobile fleet must depart Tawi-Tawi immediately. The Americans knew where they were. Toyoda agreed. The original plan for Operation Ago was to wait until the Americans committed to their invasion and then sail on June 15th to intercept them. But staying at Tawi-Tawi was no longer an option. It was suicide. On June 10th at 0800, the entire Japanese mobile fleet, 4 battleships, 9 carriers, 15 cruisers, and the remaining 24 destroyers weighed anchor and steamed northeast 6 days early, heading for the Philippine Sea. Their departure was a mess. They were disorganized and they were leaving in a hurry. American codebreakers intercepted their movement orders within hours. Admiral Raymond Spruant, commander of the American Fifth Fleet, now knew exactly where Ozawa was going, and he had an extra 6 days to prepare his reception. D, of course, knew none of this. He was still hunting. Later that same day, June 10th at 1630, he spotted 2 more destroyers patrolling the Sibutu passage. He had 5 torpedoes left, enough for 1 more attack. At 17:15, he fired a spread of 3 torpedoes at the lead destroyer. 1 struck the bow. The destroyer was heavily damaged and slowed to a stop, but it didn't sink. The second destroyer, seeing its companion hit, instantly charged Harder's position. D ran his last 2 torpedoes. Fire 4! Fire 5! Both of them missed. The conning tower was silent. They were out of torpedoes. They had no way to defend themselves. And a Japanese destroyer was bearing down on them at 32 knots, less than a mile away, its bow wave a white line of pure vengeance. "The emergency deep. Take her down. 500 feet. Harder's diving planes bit hard, pushing the submarine down at maximum angle. The men grabbed for handholds. 300 feet, 400 feet, 500 feet. The destroyer passed directly overhead. Its propellers churned the water so loudly that the crew could hear the whump, whump, whump of the individual blades through the hull.
Then, silence. The destroyer was circling back. Dealey knew the pattern. The destroyer would make multiple passes, dropping depth charges on each run until the submarine either surfaced or imploded. Harder had no torpedoes to fight back. Her only option was to endure the storm and hope the destroyer ran out of depth charges first. The first pattern of 6 depth charges dropped at 17:23. They exploded in a tight, perfect pattern right around the submarine. Harder rolled 15 degrees to starboard. Light bulbs shattered. Men were thrown against the bulkheads. A second pattern dropped 2 minutes later, even closer. The explosions lifted the submarine's stern and slammed it back down. A hydraulic line burst in the control room, spraying a fine mist of oil. For 90 minutes, the destroyer hunted them, 42 depth charges. Most exploded too shallow or too deep, but 3 came close enough to crack gauge glasses and spring minor leaks. Dealey kept Harder at 500 feet, moving at a dead slow 2 knots, making as little noise as possible. Finally, at 1900 hours, the destroyer withdrew. She had exhausted her depth charge supply. Dealey waited another hour in the crushing silence before surfacing. The ocean was empty. Harder was battered but alive. She was out of torpedoes and low on fuel. The patrol was over. She limped south toward Fremantle, Australia. Arriving on June 26th, the moment Harder tied up at the pier, Admiral Lockwood was waiting for him. He had been tracking Dealey's reports. 5 destroyers attacked, 4 confirmed sunk, 1 heavily damaged. In 12 days. It was, and still is, the most successful anti-destroyer patrol in the history of naval warfare. Lockwood awarded Dealey the Navy Cross, right there on the deck. Then he asked the question every submarine commander dreaded after a grueling patrol. "Can you do it again?" Dealey's answer was immediate. "Give me torpedoes and I'll sink 10. The Harder's crew spent July in Fremantle repairing the sub and resupplying. Dealey, now a legend in the force, trained new crew members on his down-the-throat tactic. By late July, every submarine commander in the Pacific had studied his patrol reports. The tactic worked. Between June and August, American subs, emboldened by Dealey's success, sank 14 more Japanese destroyers, using variations of his aggressive approach. The hunters had become the hunted. But the full impact of Harder's patrol was only just being understood. The Battle of the Philippine Sea began on June 19th, just 9 days after Dealey sank his 4th destroyer. Because Admiral Ozawa's fleet had been forced to leave Tawi-Tawi 6 days early, his entire battle plan collapsed. His fleet arrived scattered and disorganized. His reconnaissance planes had burned through their fuel reserves during the hasty departure and couldn't find the American fleet. His destroyers were still regrouping. His supply ships were 3 days behind schedule. When American carrier aircraft found Ozawa's fleet, the Japanese were completely unprepared. The result was a slaughter. American pilots, facing disorganized and undermanned Japanese air patrols, shot down 376 Japanese aircraft while losing only 30 of their own. They called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. American submarines, including the Kavala and Albacore, sank 2 of Ozawa's largest carriers, the Shokaku and Taiko. American planes sank a 3rd, the Haitayo. The Imperial Japanese Navy lost 75% of its carrier air groups in 2 days. It was a blow from which they would never recover. And it all happened because one submarine commander, Samuel Dealey, was aggressive enough to sink 4 destroyers in 4 days, convincing the Japanese that their fortress at Tawi-Tawi was a death trap. Admiral Lockwood, in his post-war memoir, called Harder's 5th Patrol the single most strategically important submarine operation of the entire Pacific War. On August 5, 1944, Harder departed Fremantle for her 6th war patrol. She was assigned to a 3-submarine wolf pack with the USS Harder and USS Hake. Dealey, as the senior skipper, was in command. Their mission was to patrol the waters west of Luzon in the Philippines and destroy Japanese shipping.
The patrol started with incredible success. On August 21st, the Wolfpack sank 4 large cargo ships. On August 22nd, Harder and Gato attacked a group of coastal defense vessels, sinking 3 of them. Harder was credited with 2, the frigates Matsuo and Hibari. By August 23rd, Gato had expended all her torpedoes and withdrew. This left Harder and Hake operating together off Dassel Bay. But the Japanese were learning. Their intelligence had tracked the Wolfpack's movements. They knew where the American submarines were, and this time they had sent something special to deal with them. At 0453 on August 24th, the USS Hake was submerged 4 miles off the coast. Through her periscope, her captain could see Harder on the surface, 4,500 yards to the south. They were coordinating an attack on a Japanese ship. Suddenly, Hake's sonar operator heard the one sound that made his blood run cold. Echo ranging. Close. Getting closer. 2 Japanese escort ships, CD-22 and minesweeper PB-102, were closing fast on Harder's position at 18 knots.
They were actively hunting. Japanese intelligence had intercepted the radio transmissions between the Wolfpack and knew they were in the area. Hank's captain immediately ordered his submarine deep and silent. He watched through his periscope as the 2 Japanese ships closed on Harder. His radio operator frantically tried to warn Dealey, but there was no response. At 0530, Harder finally saw them. She crash-dived, but it was too late. The Japanese ships were less than 2,000 yards away. Dealey took Harder down fast at a 35-degree angle. But in his haste, his diesel engines were still running as he submerged, leaving a massive trail of bubbles on the surface, a perfect target. The sonar operator on CD-22 had a perfect contact, range 1,200 yards, depth 200 feet, and still diving. At 0547, CD-22 made her first pass and dropped a full pattern of depth charges, all set to detonate at 250 feet. The explosions bracketed Harder perfectly. At least 3 detonated within 50 feet of her hull. The pressure hull of the Harder cracked near the after torpedo room. Seawater flooded in at a tremendous pressure. The stern compartments flooded completely in 90 seconds. The submarine's bow rose sharply as the stern dragged her down. In the control room, Dealey would have been roaring, "Blow all ballast, emergency surface." But the compressed air system, fighting against the weight of thousands of tons of flooding water, couldn't save her. At 0552, CD-22 made a second pass. This pattern hit even closer. The explosions ruptured Harder's main pressure hull in multiple locations. The control room flooded. All electrical power failed. At 600 feet, well below her maximum operating depth, Harder's hull began to implode. The bulkheads collapsed. The compartments were crushed like tin cans. At 0600, the Japanese ships reported a successful kill. Large quantities of oil, wood debris, and cork floated to the surface. They circled for 2 hours, dropping more charges to be certain. They recovered no survivors. All 79 men aboard the Harder were gone. Commander Samuel Dealey, the destroyer killer, had been killed by the very escorts he had taught the Navy how to destroy. The news of Harder's loss was a devastating blow to the submarine force. Admiral Lockwood immediately suspended all submarine operations in the area. The American public wouldn't learn the full story until after the war, but the Japanese knew. Admiral Toyoda received the report on August 26th. The devil of Tawi-Tawi was finally gone. He ordered a commendation for the crew of CD-22. What Toyoda didn't know was that the damage was already done. The tactics Dealey had pioneered were now standard doctrine. Before Harder's 5th patrol, submarines ran from destroyers after they hunted them. By the end of the war, American submarines using Dealey's down-the-throat tactic had sunk 214 Japanese warships. This included 4 aircraft carriers, 1 battleship, 9 cruisers, and 38 destroyers. Dealey's legacy was written in the wreckage of the Imperial Japanese Navy.
On March 27, 1946, President Harry Truman presented Commander Dealey's Medal of Honor to his widow, Edwina, on the White House lawn. The citation read in part, "This remarkable record of 5 vital Japanese destroyers sunk in 5 short-range torpedo attacks attests the valiant fighting spirit of Commander Dealey and his indomitable command." The Navy named a destroyer escort after him. Harder herself received the Presidential Unit citation. Her motto, "Hit him harder," became legendary. Today at the Naval Academy, instructors still teach the down-the-throat attack. Not because modern submarines would use it, our new torpedoes are far too advanced for that, but because it demonstrates a fundamental principle. When your enemy expects you to run, charging is the one thing they can't defend against. The 79 men aboard Harder came from 38 different states. They were farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Michigan, college graduates from California. They volunteered for the silent service, knowing the odds. 22% of all submariners who served in World War II died, the highest casualty rate of any branch of the American military. They knew the risk, and they served anyway. The last survivor of Harder's crew, Paul Bryce, passed away in 2022 at the age of 98. With his death, no one who served aboard that legendary boat remains to tell their story firsthand. That is why these stories matter. The official reports tell us what they did, but they can't tell us what it felt like to hear those depth charges explode, or to trust your life to the man at the periscope. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. Every click tells the algorithm that this piece of history is worth remembering, and it shows this story to more people. We're dedicated to rescuing these forgotten stories of real heroism from the archives. If you want to join us on this mission, please subscribe and turn on notifications. And finally, we have one question we always ask. Where are you watching from? Our community stretches across the entire globe, from the United States to the United Kingdom, from Canada to Australia. You're not just a viewer, you're part of a community keeping these memories alive. Please drop a comment and let us know your city or state, and tell us if someone in your family served. Thank you for watching, and thank you for ensuring that Commander Samuel Dealey and the 79 men of the USS Harder do not disappear into silence. They deserve to be remembered.